Hi everybody, I'm Gary Watson and welcome to Issues. On this week's Issues we look at 1080. DOC is between a rock and a hard place. On one hand we've got big problems with possums in New Zealand. On the other hand there are those who oppose the use of 1080. A documentary was made a few years ago on this very subject, and that is tonight's program.
New Zealand is a tourist mecca, visually spectacular, a photographer's paradise. Home to the intriguing kiwi bird. An ecological wonderland in any other place on Earth, perhaps. But is there a darker side to our clean, green, 100% pure image?
I suppose our upbringing was somewhat unusual. We were raised in the backcountry of the central North Island, the Urewera National Park. Our father was a commercial hunter. His occupation for 30 odd years involved hunting wild deer and carrying them out on his back. There was no money paid until the complete carcass in one piece was delivered to the meat buyers. Life for our mother, raising 5 kids in the wilderness, was a lonely and trying existence. However, she stuck it out and endured the primitive lifestyle for which we are all forever grateful. We were happy kids with lots of exciting activities to pursue. Of course, life in the bush was just one big wild adventure. Over the years, our passion for the outdoors and wildlife only grew stronger. Most of our time in the bush these days is spent on still photography and videography. As time went by, we, like many others, grew more and more concerned at the ever-increasing use of 1080 poison in New Zealand.
1080 is used to control introduced possums and other wild animals.
We also found that the wider community are largely oblivious to what's going on.
So what is 1080 poison?
1080 is an alias for monofluoroacetate, a chemical. It blocks a particular step in the Krebs cycle, which is essential for the metabolism of oxygen in every cell of every animal. It kills everything that breathes air, everything from earthworms to elephants, including native birds. The World Health Organization classifies 1080 as extremely hazardous. Most countries ban it outright.
2 forms of poison bait are used in aerial operations in New Zealand. The cereal pellets constitute carbohydrate and protein and are laced with poison. The second form of bait is carrot pieces. Carrots are delivered to the operation site in their complete raw form. They are then processed on site into chunks. The carrots are then applied with poison and a green-coloured dye. The poison carrots are then loaded into the hoppers and flown by helicopter or fixed wing to the treatment area for broadcasting. .1080 poison is used to kill introduced mammals. The Australian brush-tail possum is one of the primary targets and covers most of New Zealand. They were first introduced over 150 years ago to establish a fur trade. Rats are the other primary target of aerial pest control operations in New Zealand. Bush rats have been present in New Zealand bush for over 700 years.
New Zealand uses 85% of the world's supply. I'm not sure what that means, but I guess the rest of the world hasn't figured out what a wonderful thing it really is.
There are 3 authoritative bodies that aerially spread poisons across New Zealand: the Department of Conservation, the Animal Health Board and regional councils. New Zealand drops into its forests about 4,000 kilos of pure 1080 per year, enough to kill 20 million people. On a per acre basis, this is 350 times more 1080 than Australia and 22,000 times the rest of the world.
And the more they use, the more frustrated the public are becoming. And in some cases, some individuals are going to great lengths to voice their concerns.
For many years, protests have been a regular response to the aerial 1080 drops in New Zealand. Some have been disruptive.
I'm sorry, I wasn't actually invited to the meeting on Monday night.
And some, like the recently released book Scenic Dream or Silent Nightmare by Kate Winters, more subdued. But whether aggressive or passive, their message is nonetheless consistently disturbing.
These people have been fighting 1080 poison for over a decade. and it's an uphill battle.
They're going to be dropping 1080 in 2 weeks, probably 2 weeks around here. There's been no consultation whatsoever. We know what 1080 does to the animals. It's a very, very agonising death. So we've come down here with our carrots as a symbol of the 1080 drops.
But carrots weren't all the protesters had to offer. They also brought a bag of dead birds. Casualties, they say, of an aerial drop in Turangi 2 years ago.
That's one you reckon you don't get.
Protesters say they've been driven to these actions because DOC just won't listen.
The program is absolutely insane. I'm a tourism operator. This is having a real significant impact on my business.
Apart from all the reasons not to use this stuff, they just blatantly ignore the most profoundly obvious of all, just how cruel this stuff is and how long it takes to kill an animal.
One horse was actually found in the paddock, dead up against the pine trees. It obviously been thrashing around for quite some time, had a lot of mucus, it almost looked like its lungs are blowing out of its face. Another horse was also found in that same paddock under a pine tree, and of course the fourth horse to die was Bullet, and she died in the paddock behind us in town. They don't want to eat, they lose all body coordination, they actually have trouble even standing. The veins in their bodies basically pop out completely white like a shock. You can see that the animals are so distressed, there is absolutely nothing that you can do to help them. Shortly before she died, she was involuntary urinating everywhere. It was absolutely just horrific to watch. She'd even lost the ability to swallow. The vitamins we were giving via a syringe mixed with water, and it was all it entailed was putting that into the mouth, and all they needed to do was swallow. She even lost the ability to be able to do that. But 3 days of watching her agonise and get worse and worse to still come to that horrible demise. There's more animals than possums and dogs that become affected by it and will die horribly from it.
When you see cattle or sheep literally shitting blood, lose all control of themselves, some of these animals die basically with their bum up in the air still and their feet down on the ground or their front knees down on the ground. They have died with no control.
We had a 1080 drop in the Hokanui Hills, and the Hokanui wild sheep, which were Spanish Merino, have been there for over 120 years. And we had pleaded with SPCA, we had gone to every organisation that we could think of that might be able to help us to protect these sheep from being poisoned, and nobody was even slightly interested, and so the drop went ahead, and we thought, well, we'll go in just immediately after the drop and gather these lambs up and give them a feed. Well, it was too late because the lambs had obviously drunk the milk from their mothers, and they were as dead as their mothers were there in the bush. It was horrible.
The drop was Friday, and the Wednesday I came out and I actually witnessed one of last year's fawns dying, and it's the most horrific death I have ever witnessed on any poor animal. It was cruel. She started off the first, she went into like a rigor mortis, everything went tense, and she was screaming in agony, and then she'd soften up, and then she'd thrash around, and she was screaming, and then she'd tense up again. And it carried on for about 3/4 of an hour, and eventually she died.
1080 is indiscriminate. It kills everything, not only the adults but even their young, whether by eating baits directly or through drinking their mother's contaminated milk.
One of the implications of this poison, that little piglet just wanders around looking for mum.
Now look at this little guy here. Didn't get much of a chance at life, probably only a few weeks old. Just along here is one of his mates, and possibly took out the whole family, all his little brothers and sisters. Tragic, isn't it?
This is the evil nature of this stuff. It just kills everything in its way. This poor little fawn had no chance. You know, ground control allows for a little bit of discrimination and you can have a little bit of mercy, but this stuff's just evil. The tragic thing is, of course, that all the hinds that we're finding and the ones that are dead have probably all got fawns.
Approximately 20,000 deer are killed annually by 1080 drops. The deer kill rate per 1080 drop is about 50%.
This is where Department of Conservation put bait stations filled with 1080 poison. Without my knowledge, there's no signage. No one within the neighbourhood had been informed that 1080 was laid there. They told me, "Didn't you know about it? I thought the operators were coming through your place."
You can kill over 2,500 25 kilogram dogs with the amount of 1080 that is usually put on a hectare. 2,500 dogs.
I took my dogs for a walk, my two Rottweilers, for a walk on my property. I locked them up at 1 o'clock in the afternoon because I was going fishing at 3. I went fishing and arrived home at 9 o'clock. We went inside and had a meal. We heard this noise in the cage. The dog was thrashing around, frothing at its mouth. Oh, it's unbelievable what was happening. I pulled it out of the kennel. I put it over here by the light and proceeded with CPR on the dog. My best mate, had him since he was a pup. Oh, I hope I never see anything like it again. It's affected us, the whole family. I just don't want it to happen again to anyone.
Once the signs of poisoning start, they become hyperactive and run and snap and bite. And then the nervous system becomes increasingly involved. They lose control of their bowels and their bladder. They experience twitching of their muscles, often facial muscles. Then the spasms of the muscles become more severe and they develop very strong spasms of muscles in their legs and tail that make all of their limbs and tail very stiff. Dogs might die during fitting, but often there are repeated fits with periods where they recover in between. There's a 2-hour period of symptoms before they die.
I myself have been involved with 8 dogs that have been lost over the years. It is pretty horrific what you see these dogs go through, and regardless of whether you've got muzzles or whatever, there is still going to be dogs right throughout the country lost on farms. That's just the on-farm dogs without any of the other pet dogs or anything else around. It is horrific, and we're expected to work right in the middle of all this stuff.
1080 is not a humane poison, and despite people's claims that it is humane, we now recognise that that's not the case. It's not good enough to pretend to ourselves that it's humane and keep on doing the same old thing that we've been doing for years. There's no excuse to keep on using a poison that is not humane and that we know is not humane.
When I was on the faculty at the University of California in medicine and medical information science, which is probably the most important part of this, is I specialized in the design and evaluation of scientific research. Basically, how you go about telling when a piece of science is worth paying attention to. So in a way, we were perhaps uniquely qualified to undertake this project. We spent almost 6 months going through the scientific literature and writing a 100-page, fully referenced, highly detailed appraisal of what the scientists actually showed about the benefits and harm being done by this extraordinary practice.
The study that we did resulted in some results that were really hard for us to believe, and they were shocking and they were actually disturbing because The Department of Conservation is supposed to engender trust, and yet what we found was that they had badly violated the public's trust.
DOC's research states that most New Zealand forest-dwelling birds are vulnerable to 1080 poison, either by eating baits directly or through secondary poisoning.
The evidence is overwhelming that aerial 1080 is killing tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of birds. The species involved are extensive. They include the robins, the tomtits, the weka, the moorpork, the kea, the list goes on and on. We compiled the numbers on this based on DOC's own evidence, the documented cases where they looked at populations after 1080 drops and either had well-documented counts or radio-tagged birds. This is a small percentage of the drops, but you can put these data together and come to some fairly firm conclusions. Those conclusions are devastating. They're profoundly disturbing. The numbers vary from 3% to 30% of populations, depending on species, per drop. And these drops are happening every 2 to 3 years. You'd call this decimation, except that the word decimation means killing only 1 in 10. 1 in 10 would be a good day for the tomtits, as they generally seem to hit about 30%. 1 in 10 would be a good day for keas, as the evidence indicates that they're killing almost 25% there. So decimation is not the appropriate word to describe what DOC is doing to these native species. The situation could be worse. If you look at the 95% confidence intervals, it could be as much as from 20 to 50% of the species we know about, and many species just haven't been studied at all. When pushed into a corner, they admit that birds do die, but they defend the practice by saying that the populations are made up because of decreased predation by feral mammals. Now, that would be good. If they had evidence that that were the case, then I would say what they're doing is, at least with regard to the birds, the particular species, is a perfectly rational thing to do. But they have no evidence that, that the birds make up their populations. They have no evidence of benefit to any native species. No competent scientific study shows a benefit to any species of native birds. So DOC's rationalization on this is propaganda. I'm glad I'm not the one that has to defend this carnage.
We know that it knocks out all the birds as well, because this was thriving 3 or 4 weeks ago.
We had tuis, we had wood pigeons. The noise was phenomenal. We had
Even
robins
cicadas.
and
You don't hear any cicadas anymore.
they were scattered around. They were in the bush. They were lying down, but they were gone fairly quickly because we used to have a lot of wekas.
Anything that dies straight into it.
And I guess a lot of those wekas are now dead, and they're supposedly a protected species. It's a $30,000 fine if you get caught killing one of these animals, and yet DOC can come in and poison thousands of them and it's okay.
Weka are endemic to New Zealand and are part of the rail family. Weka are opportunists and scavengers. They eat insects, bush fruit, rats and mice and carrion.
Everybody's been led to believe that 1080 doesn't kill weka, but while I was tramping the Copeland Valley I picked up a weka on the side of the track. So I carted it out, gave it to the Department of Conservation and Fox Classy to be autopsied, and the end result was that it was found to have been killed by 1080.
Bird species are actually quite susceptible to 1080, and in fact both wekas and ducks have been measured by seeing just how much 1080 actually kills them, and the amount of 1080 we put on a hectare would be more than enough to kill 500 wekas with the amount of 1080 cereal bait that you put on a hectare. So enormous killing power out there.
Okay, here's a great example of how our wild creatures and birds are being slaughtered by 1080. Here's a dead possum, possibly poisoned, that the wekas are coming along and devouring in great amounts. In the name of conservation, let's just dump it all over the forest. Weka, we can afford to lose them. What else can we afford to lose? You know, we hear this nonsense about this doesn't take that and that doesn't take that. It's only the rats and the ferrets that eat this sort of thing. And this is the proof that you need to say, stop this nonsense with 1080 poison immediately before we run out of all sorts of things. You could wipe out weka, for example, in just one drop perhaps, because they like to pick on bits and pieces like this. It's a disgrace.
In the paper, Secondary Risks from 1080 in Carcasses, the authors state, while talking about Brodifacoum poisoning, for example, the entire western weka population of Tawhitinui Island was exterminated by eating baits or dead or dying rats.
Oh, to be healthy.
Lifestyle, diet and exercise, complemented with quality supplements, can provide you the insurance vital for your natural health and well-being. With over 10 years professional experience making some of New Zealand's most trusted nutritional supplement brands, visit the Oh to be Healthy factory outlet in Wakatu Industrial Estate. Over 200 supplements to choose from, free on-site parking, no middleman.
Oh, to be healthy. Caring for you naturally.
The majority of information in our life comes to us through our vision. With only one set of eyes to last our lifetime, it's important that you look after them. For over 20 years, Physique Harrington Eye Care has led the way in providing the Nelson Tasman region with professional eye care. Our team are committed to providing you and your family with the highest standard of eye care. As part of this commitment, at Physique Harrington Eye Care, we recommend Crizal lenses. Crizal is a revolutionary lens which repels dust and fingerprints. This means it's easier to clean and stays cleaner longer. Visit us at our Nelson, Richmond practices and ask about our Crizal satisfaction guarantee.
Why would you want to pay as much as $1,000 for a single bed mattress when you can buy a high quality locally made mattress like this for as little as $220? And a queen size mattress could cost you in excess of $3,000, but at Nelson Beds you could have a mattress like this as low as $425. So why would you go out and spend a fortune on your child's bedroom when you can come to Nelson Beds and buy a complete single mattress and base set, a 7-drawer Scotch chest, a headboard and a 3-drawer bedside cabinet for as little as $979? So call and discuss our custom manufacturing options and local after sales service at Nelson Beds, Nelson's only bedding manufacturer.
Discover the Belgrove Tavern just 20 minutes south of Richmond on State Highway 6 for meals, functions, weddings, barbecues and garden bar with lots of room for kids. Come and see us.
It's not only the baits we have to be concerned about in the forest, but this particular drop took place 4 months ago. Now the cool-off period used to be 3 months. I think they've just increased it to 6 months in a lot of areas, but this particular carcass here is still fairly intact, and I dare say that in another couple of months there'll still be some of it left, and it's still toxic for that whole period. Now if a dog or any other creature, a bird starts pecking at it, anything like that, I dare say they're going to suffer the same fate.
Once the poison is ingested by an animal, it is then retained in the carcass of that animal and is then capable of poisoning the next feeder down the food chain, whether that feeder be an insect, bird, animal, or even a human.
In 2008, someone in the Department of Conservation leaked an internal report to the Dominion Post. This internal report acknowledged the death of 7 of 17 keas on the Fox Glacier due to aerial 1080 poisoning.
The feathered fools of New Zealand's forests and mountains are falling victim to the very poison that's supposed to protect them. 7 West Coast kea have died since May. 6 of them had ingested recently dropped 1080 poison.
We've combined that with the numbers from the other tag kea and have calculated the estimated death rate per drop for keas. It's around 25%, with a confidence interval that goes from 13 or 14 up to about 40.
The Conservation Department admits it's done little direct research into the effect of 1080 on kea numbers, but some believe these alpine entertainers are being wiped out in the high country by the very department that's supposed to be protecting them.
One of the things that this suggests is the extent to which DOC is withholding this information. This report about the keas would never hit the light of day had there not been a whistleblower. How did DOC respond? They did not apologize for the aerial 1080. They did not apologize for the deaths. What they did do is they claimed that 40% of fledgling keas are killed by possums. There is no evidence to that effect in the scientific literature. I'm highly skeptical that they have evidence that 40% of kea fledglings are killed by possums. Now, if they've got it, by all means, they should trot it out right away. The issue is that there is no evidence that the kea population is being benefited by this practice. You have to have bottom line evidence that the population is being benefited. Not that the fledglings are being benefited or that they are being preyed on by possums or not being preyed on possums. The question is, what is aerial 1080 doing to this population? Now, it's going to take some extraordinary breeding and some extraordinary possum results to make up for 25% loss every 3 years due to DOC drops.
When you take out 40% of the kea in one operation at Franz Josef, how many operations do you have to do before you've extincted the kea? Not many, because once you get down to a certain point, it's very hard to breed them back.
The thought of even 7 of these wonderful birds dying the slow and agonizing death so pointlessly and so callously is just emotional to those of us who really care about New Zealand's environment.
In areas where there's been repeated aerial drops, we've noticed that obvious reduction in moorpork, our only native owl. So I've decided to go and visit one of New Zealand's leading experts on moorpork to see what he's got to say.
I've seen huge effects, and I don't mean small, but huge effects of 1080 upon the moorpork. The muscle structure all drops after they've taken hold of some of the baby possums that have escaped from the mother's pouches. They do take hold of anything. They're scavengers. Anything that's small. We feed the owls out in the bush on mice. They come down and take them, and of course they've really gone cold by the time they get hold of them. But in fact, I've found dead rats, and I've even found a dead small baby stoat in an owl hide. There's no 1080 drops, or before 1080 drops started, I might get 3 or 4 birds handed in a year. Once the 1080s drop started, can be 16 or 17 times. And so my concern is, because the owl takes so long to reproduce numbers, we could see the end of the species in certain areas of our country.
You take the robin study. It went on for 3 years, and what they showed was that a substantial portion of the robins died as a consequence of this. However, this being one of the few studies that looked at all 3 variables, death, fledgling success, and population success, no change in the population. So robins were killed. There was a slight increase in fledgling success, but it did not translate into population success. And yet DOC habitually cites this as proof that 1080 benefits robins, when we know, in fact, what it does is kill robins.
The effects of poisoning are very similar in birds to other animals as well. When birds are poisoned, they become quiet, they ruffle up their feathers, they drool and have difficulty breathing, they become clumsy and uncoordinated, they start to have twitching of their muscles and convulsions where their limbs become very stiff and their backs curve back, and then they have fits and they die. How long it takes a bird to die from 1080 is going to depend on the individual bird. One bird will differ from another. It's going to depend on how much poison they ate as well. So it's very hard to predict exactly how long a bird would have symptoms for. But in general, it's fair to say that a poisoned bird will have symptoms of 1080 poisoning for somewhere between hours and days.
Many New Zealand birds are vulnerable to secondary poisoning. This occurs when the bird consumes insects or the carrion of an animal that was poisoned or killed by 1080. Because there is no control over how much poison an animal ingests, animals that die contain varying amounts of poison in their carcass. The next feeder down the food chain then may receive either a sublethal or lethal dose of poison. Birds and animals that do recover from sublethal poisoning may be left with long-term disability or diminished breeding capability.
Another danger facing the bird life in New Zealand is that what they're feeding their young may be poisonous and even killing their offspring. Now, it doesn't just stop with the carrion. It could be insects or even the larger birds taking whole baits back to the nest. Looks like a tomtit. Pretty little guy, isn't he?
The specific issue of tomtit deaths and low dosage baits was addressed in by Westerbrook in 2005. What they found was that if they reduced the dose of cereal bellies low enough, they did dramatically reduce the death of tomtits. However, when they reduced the amount of 1080 in carrot baits to even very low levels, they still killed up to 50% of tomtits.
As we found out through an OIA, DOC is still using large quantities of carrot baits, both medium and low dose carrot baits in their drops.
Yeah, they don't deny it. And in fact, IRMA authorized a dosage almost 10 times higher than the one that still killed 50% of tomtits. In addition to all that, we have a report from a DOC scientist, Claire Veltman, in which she concluded that the low bait strategy was not working. She did comment, however, that they presume that the deaths were compensated by increased breeding success, and eventually the tomtits made it up. There's no proof of that, of course.
And they referred to the Robin study. Right. But the Robin study didn't benefit the population. So it's sort of a circular reference situation where one references the other, bad study or non-consequential study, and it's a self-reinforcing rumor, effectively.
Right, that's what happens. And then Forest and Birds gets involved, and they pick up what DOC says the study shows and don't actually go and look at the study and amplify the whole process either. Pretty soon, you've got the whole population of New Zealand believing what is an absolute falsehood.
Yeah, well, I'm a bloke that's been involved in the bush for 40 years, hunting, tramping, an environmentalist pretty much, and I've become really concerned about the dramatic drop in our bird species in the bush after 1080 drops. So I've basically taken it on myself to go out and monitor operations after they've been carried out. And these are some of the bird species that I've found. There's tomtits, fantail, there's a swallow, and this is only the tip of the iceberg. It's criminal what is carrying on in clean green New Zealand.
The Mapara study is DOC's flagship study of benefit to native species. In fact, the Mapara study illustrates most of DOC's bad research and design habits. Historical controls, no randomization, no replication, and several statistical errors. Thus, even from the start, it does not meet the minimal criteria for scientific validity. In one promotional brochure, DOC claims that there was a 10-fold increase in kokako population. There is no indication of that in the scientific literature. The scientific report shows that the population may have gone from 55 to 85, but it was not as a consequence of Aerial 1080. The increase in population occurred 3 years after Aerial 1080 had been discontinued and was replaced by ground-based control methods. Nonetheless, DOC propaganda makes it seem as though Mapara was a triumph for Aerial 1080. This is an outrage in itself, and as I think everyone would agree, that this is gross misrepresentation. This distracts from what is probably a very useful observation. Namely, with species-specific, ground-based trapping, you can actually help native species to recover.
A lady friend of ours told us of a 1080 wood pigeon that she handed in to DOC. She's also still got another one in her freezer. This report is right here, and it confirms that there are 3 samples of wood pigeons in their labs with levels of 1080 in them.
Consider, for example, the 2003 Whirinaki Forest study in which they looked at caribou, the wood pigeon, and kaka. As usual, the elements of good scientific research design were missing. They studied fledgling success, but even then, they actually combined the results from the control and the study group, and that was the only thing they reported. They went on in the abstract section to claim that the study had worked. Not because they had shown that it worked, but because it had been shown to work at Motauto in 2004. In that study, they looked at a total of 12 species of both native and feral birds. But there was only one randomized control area, which was demonstrably completely different from the treated area. So right from the start, the results were invalidated. The authors reported in the abstract section a statistically increased number of wood pigeons, caribou, which seems to have been the primary target of the research. However, in their analysis, they used and so the study was doubly invalidated. Not only did they have a completely incomparable control group, which you could see from their own data, but the study was invalidated by they analyzed the data incorrectly. I mean, it's just a gross statistical error. But even so, it's instructive to look at how they reported what have to be called spurious results. What they reported in the abstract section of that paper was that the caribou population benefited from the use of Aerial 1080. They failed to even mention in the abstract section that that same erroneous, fallacious analysis that they believed, you understand, they believed this analysis, also showed that there were decreased numbers of silver eyes and gray warblers. Now, it's hard to imagine how you can choose one native species and say that was an important find that Aerial 1080 increased that, but it decreased the others. Well, of course, none of this is very meaningful because there's so many flaws in the study. We reanalyzed their data and were unable to show much value in it at all. But the one thing that absolutely did stand out was that myna birds' population had increased relative pre and post and study to control areas by 400%. In other words, the big benefiter in that study was myna birds. This is consistent with the observation that feral species of birds may be doing at least as much harm to native species by displacing them from their ecological niches. DOC is doing absolutely nothing about the feral birds.
I got a licence to use 1080 in 1960. I did a lot of the original research into this poison, and I've used it virtually ever since. Most of my working life's been involved with it. I've done all the groundwork, I've done the aerial operations, I've mixed the field solutions, I've done the whole lot. And it's been my repeated trips back to the same places all the time over many years that's shown very clearly the effect it's having. And even when I was using it. So unless we do something about it, they are going to be responsible for wiping some of our native birds out. I've heard all the stories about the good nesting after they've done the drops and that, and most of it to me is rubbish. Department of Conservation studiously ignore everyone but themselves.
DOC claims that in 2010 they're going to start a study to, quotes, determine the effect of Aerial 1080 on native birds. Even assuming that they abandon all their bad study design habits, they are at least 17 or 18 years late. They have been dropping this substance into our environment, into our native forest, indiscriminately, killing thousands, tens of thousands, and maybe hundreds of thousands of native birds for 17 years. And now they're telling us that they're going to go do a study that we have no assurance will be at any better quality than the ones they've already done? To practice now until they have legitimate proof of benefit to native species. A 10-year study is about what it would take.
.1080 was originally developed as an insecticide. However, researchers soon discovered that it killed practically every insect that ate it.
Wetters are one of the true insects, six-legged insects. What really kills the wetters is the carrot bait or the grain bait, because they find both carrots and the grain bait absolutely delicious, and they just eat it until they die. And that's well known and well documented.
What happened in the wetter study was the authors reported that there was no evidence of effect of Aerial 1080 on wetters. And if you look at the graph for tree wetters, that indeed seems to be the case. But if you look at the graph for cave wetters, there's virtually conclusive evidence that there was a profound difference developing between 80 and the ones that were not. There was almost a 50% decline in cave wetters in that study.
And there was an earlier lab-based study in which they fed wetters both 1080 baits and foliage, and just as in the field test, 50% of the wetters died.
DOC commissioned a study by their premier invertebrate scientist, Mike Meads, to determine what the effect of Aerial 1080 drops was on invertebrate populations. Now, we all know what invertebrates are. They're the insects, the spiders, the bugs, the worms, everything that doesn't have a backbone. As you're probably aware, these are essential creatures in any environment. They're responsible for decomposing leaf litter, they're responsible for breaking down animal carcasses. Bugs are the backbone of the environment. What the Mead study showed was that about 50% of invertebrates, if you looked at the overall populations among all species, were killed.
And this proved, beyond a doubt that these insects were being killed by the effects of 1080.
When DOC heard about this result, they immediately commissioned another study. It went so far as that Meads had to show how to do the trapping technique that allowed you to measure the deaths of these animals. But they analyzed the study in a way that virtually guaranteed he would see no difference between the experimental and the control groups. When you fail to detect a difference, what you say is, well, we didn't detect a difference. You don't say it isn't true. you say we didn't detect a difference between the experimental and control. Maybe we have to do the study again.
When it came out, the first thing Doc wanted was to see the report and take over everything.
Now, Mike Meads had every intention of publishing his results, but Doc refused to allow him to do so, despite the fact that there were 6 or 7 favorable peer reviews. The very fact that there were 6, I guess a total of 9 as I've heard it, peer reviews of that study suggests that they were concerned about this. So basically they were peer reviewing it till they got a bad one, and then they said, no, we can't publish this. Meads was essentially forced out of his job at DSIR.
Back in 1994, when I did my report, I suggested that we need long-term monitoring because we were just fiddling around, not really knowing what was killing what by what rate. Everybody agreed, long-term monitoring, yes, we must have long-term monitoring. It's now 2008, 14 years after I gave that recommendation. Not one piece of long-term monitoring has been entered into at all.
And so we are left with this virtual certainty, or at least strong suspicion, that a very important element of our forest ecosystems are being systematically poisoned every 3 years.
We discovered dust and fragments were enough to blow across an area and kill invertebrates down on the ground months afterwards. Has any studies been done on this? Not a one.
I mean, Doc to this day continues to assert what amounts to an oxymoron, that somehow an insecticide, a substance invented as an insecticide, does not kill insects. This is beyond belief, that they actually continue to assert in public that an insecticide does not kill insects on the basis of one badly analyzed study. This issue alone, if there were no other issues, if there were not all the dead birds, if there were not the lack of evidence of benefit, if there were not all the ecosystem concerns, this one issue alone should be enough to just shut this thing down tomorrow.
It's estimated that there are about 50,000 multicellular species, that is plants, animals and fungi, that are native to New Zealand but have not yet been formally described. So it's inconceivable to me that any individual or organisation can feel that there's sufficient known about 1080 to be applying it aerially.
Fundamental tenet of ecology is that all living things live in equilibrium. When one disturbs the equilibrium by altering the population of one or more, there will be changes that are unpredictable and unpredicted. And given the broad-based and crude structure of what Doc is doing in poisoning our forests with Aerial 1080, that's exactly what you'd expect. Murphy in 1998 did what is now a classical study. They looked at the diets of stoats in various rat control regimens. The results of this were startling. They surprised people around the world. With no pest control, rats constituted about 50% of stoats' diets. And birds, including native birds, constituted about 6%. After Aerial 1080, however, stoats switched their diets to birds, away from rats, so that the proportions almost inverted. The birds became 56% of the stoat diet, and the rats became 16%. Consider, for example, the Rusco study that was just published in 2008. The Rusco study compared rat populations after various forms of pest control. The population of rats dropped immediately at the time of the pest control. But what they also found was that it very quickly rose, not to the pre-pest control level, but almost double, in fact more than double, of that pre-post control level by 18 months. And by 25 months, the population of rats had risen to almost 3 times the pre-rat control levels. It is reasonable to assume, and there are data to show, that the population of stoats tends to follow them. So then what happens? DOC comes in with another 1080 drop, as they say they intend to do ad infinitum, forever. Every 2 to 3 years, drop 1080 into our forest ecosystems. Again, the population of rats will drop off rapidly. And what are the stoats going to then switch their diet to? As Murphy showed, they're going to switch them to native birds. One of those birds is likely to be kiwi.
The kiwi is New Zealand's national bird, our icon you might say, and yet probably as many as 99% of New Zealanders have never seen one in the wild. A lot of that is due to the fact that they are mainly considered a nocturnal bird. However, on Stewart Island, it's possible to see one in daylight.
Take the kiwi who's running around on the forest floor feeding, and he's got a long bill and he's got his whiskers up on the top end and what have you. He penetrates the soil, and this is the kiwi's main feeding action, is to penetrate the soil and go for all the invertebrates that it can reach. If it's soft, it doesn't matter what colour it is, if it's soft and edible, it's gone for if the kiwi gets his beak on it.
Kiwi feed on soil invertebrates and so may be at risk from secondary poisoning. Since Irma approved the continued use of aerial 1080 in New Zealand, the quantities released into our environment have increased. We drop over 2,000 tonnes of 1080 bait every year into our forests and national parks. We inflict suffering and death upon thousands of wild and domestic animals, native and non-native, and all this takes place conveniently concealed behind the walls of our forests. Miles Nakahara, the Forest and Wildlife Branch Manager on the island of Hawaii, when discussing our 1080 practice here in New Zealand stated, "You will lose the very thing you are trying to save." This documentary is dedicated to Mike Meads, who put scientific truth and his beloved invertebrates ahead of his career by standing up against aerial 1080 when no one else would.
Well, as you can see, the subject is very controversial, and I'm sure the debate will continue. That's Issues for another week. We'll see you here at the same time next week. If you have an issue you'd like us to discuss, please don't hesitate to email us at issues@7-media.net.
Hi, my name's Ian Mortimer. Mortimer Auto Upholstery is your one-stop shop for all your upholstery needs. We do car and boat interiors, boat canopies, ute tonneau covers, canvas and PVC fabrication. Call in and see us in Oxford Mews, 72 Oxford Street, Richmond.
To be healthy.
Lifestyle, diet and exercise, complemented with quality supplements, can provide you the insurance vital for your natural health and well-being. With over 10 years professional experience making some of New Zealand's most trusted nutritional supplement brands, visit the To Be Healthy factory outlet in Wakatu Industrial Estate. Over 200 supplements to choose from, free on-site parking, no middleman.
To be healthy. Caring for you naturally.
Hi. Gus Bulens of Gustav's Clothing for Men on Trafalgar Street. I'd like to invite all the people of Nelson, Tasman and international and local visitors to come and check out our brand new refurbished store, which is now chock full of the latest international and New Zealand brands. From France, Lacoste; from the UK, Ben Sherman; R.M. Williams; from Sweden, Gant; from the US, Calvin Klein jeans; and from New Zealand, Rembrandt suits, jackets and trousers; Cutler, Berlin and snowy fine merino knitwear. So come on into Gustav's on Trafalgar Street and we'll look after you.
If you have a complaint about any program on Mainland TV, you can write to Mainland Broadcasting, Box 595 Nelson, or contact the Broadcasting Standards Authority.
Nelson Tire Center. Great prices, great service. Buy your own Bryford trailer. All types, all sizes. See Colin Douglas for your tires and batteries.